Hello and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. My name is Ron Rogers with AHEAD. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Vijay Venkatesan, Chief Data Officer at Horizon Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Welcome, Vijay.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning as well.
Claims data, in my opinion, is typically very structured, fairly clean.
Right.
Provider data is, we'll just say, less clean. And generally is complicated. And also when you combine the two, then you bring in some master data management issues. So which is a big deal, obviously, in trying to leverage AI. So what would you think would be a solid strategy for addressing that across healthcare industry?
Yeah, I think one of the ways we're approaching it, and I'll just give you kind of our perspective, is we're starting with establishing what I call an AI governing framework. So we have our chief privacy, security, compliance, and the business stakeholders, along with our IT stakeholders, saying what is the committee that we need to say what is the right way to frame the dialogue, what are our guiding principles. The second piece of this is also around saying where do we have data completeness. So it's almost a data scorecard that says for the claims data, we're at 95% complete. I'm just kind of making that up. For eligibility, we're at about 90. But for provider, maybe we're only at 65 because most of the provider data we get, other than credentialing and what comes on a claim record, is all about payment and reimbursement. So there may be data fields that we need that aren't showing up, like what's the billing address of a provider, what's their practice location, or what is their specialty that we need to figure out. If they practice on a Monday in location A and a different location on a Wednesday, where do we know where did the actual service transpire and all those kind of things. So provider is an area where there's a lot of gaps in terms of data completeness. So we evaluate that on a scorecard and then say, based on what's available, what's complete, what are those use cases that fall under those buckets? And then using that as our evaluation criteria. And in that, we also think about bias, which is the data that we have is somewhat indicative of a bias. What's the responsible way to do it? Should we create an LLM or buy an LLM? And if so, what are the pitfalls of that? Should I get my data all internal and not combined with external data? So those decision points. And where is it appropriate to anonymize or not anonymize your data? So it's really that framework that's key in our minds. So that start with governance, get to the use cases where you have a high degree of data completeness, make sure that there's no implication of either looking at data internally and externally, making sure that you've accounted for the responsibility component. And that then lends itself to how do you operationalize. But the most important thing we stress on is the operations prepared to use the insights and create a meaningful action? Because if you don't close that loop, it's just another data point, another insights with no end in sight. So we're very focused on saying is operationally, are you prepared to do something with it? If you can't answer that question, we say that's not a great use case.
So I want to flip back to the, are you prepared to do something with that? Brings up a good point, but you actually touched on a few things. So I'm trying to stay somewhat organized, but your answers are very deep, which I appreciate. As far as data completeness, as well as model bias, how do you feel REL-SOGI helps account for those areas?
Yeah, I think with the model, but the data completeness piece, we have a data quality framework. So all of the data that lands in our data assets, we have a mechanism to measure the quality of the data. So simple things like we have a data quality scorecard that says on eligibility, these important 15 or 18 attributes don't have this level of completeness, or for by this line of business we have more completeness versus less completeness. So if you're a commercial member or a Medicare member or a Medicaid member, we talk about data completeness that way. And then the other thing we do also is that we do a overall reasonability scan that says for what purpose is this data good for. So if it's for population health, is that a good data source or not? If it's for financial analysis, are we at a good place or not? So those type of reasonability is also done. In addition, what we've done to make the data more usable is to use the traditional predictive models to build what we call member level attributes. So that kind of enhance the eligibility file to say, is this member dual eligible? Is that member in some disease management program? What are the patient risk scores? Have they missed their gaps in, do they have gaps in care? So we're trying to create what we call a feature store around a member and put that in, that kind of enhances that data. So it becomes more complete, if you will, for some of those use cases. So I think data quality framework is key. On the responsible AI side, on the bias side, we work with our Blue Cross Blue Shield Association to see what guideline principles they have established. We look at other industry benchmarks around it, talk to industry perspectives as well, and bring that in. But to me, it's more about making sure that your data, as you're using it, you have a sense for what is the demographic that you are trying to advocate for within your community. What have you seen, and what is the benchmark showing? So those are all things we look at, both internal and external data resources, to get that bias at least understood, if not totally resolved, if you will.
Great. So to your point of member stories, once that is fully built out,
Yeah.
And really is a data as a service,
Yeah.
is that something that Horizon, or I'm sorry, do you think that is something that the industry could use both internally and externally facing?
Yeah, I think the key is going to be that, one of the things I did not mention, and I'll speak to a little bit, is that, as you think about data democratization, right, one of the things that you're going to have as a key pillar is your operating model for how you do data and analytics. Is that going to evolve as well? So one of the things that I think I am predicting is that you're going to have more of this, what I call a hub and spoke operating model, which is that you're going to have a lot of functions that should be done in a centralized way happening at kind of in the hub like model, which is the hub may be responsible for bringing the data in, integrating and homogenizing it, applying standard business rules, applying governing frameworks, those type of things. And then you're going to have these spokes, which could be individual units, or it could be external vendor partners. We're going to say we're going to take that and do something with. And so what you want in that hub and spoke model is this notion of data democratization, where you're trying to homogenize or to centralize or streamline as many of these common rules that should be standard across. And that's the model. That's kind of what we're attempting to do, is to build this hub and spoke operating model and saying, here are the hub functions, hub accountabilities. Here are the spoke functions, spoke accountabilities, so that you could have democratization at scale. Because sometimes the word democracy gets abused, because if you don't have a constitution, you don't have a democracy. So we always say, who is the builder of the constitution, or the originator of it in some ways, which is your governance framework. So that's what a hub should maintain and manage and distribute and educate. And then the spoke should be able to adhere to it within that framework, but still have, freedom of speech and freedom of and other freedoms as established in the Constitution. So that's kind of the model we're trying to emulate in some ways. And so we're in the early stages of that. But that, I think, is how the industry is going to move, because you're going to have a lot of people trying to solve a lot of issues around the periphery, but they need good quality data. And so unless you can think in those terms, it's going to be very hard to scale.
Great. I love the analogy with the Constitution, by the way. Yeah, healthcare is really a data industry. It really is. So when you describe the hub, it sounds like you're discussing the medallion architecture. Is that correct?
I think people have told me, am I creating a data fabric or a data mesh or something to that effect? And I say I stay away from those buzzwords, because then it gets into a very hypothetical and an idealistic discussion. I'm trying to say, I'm just trying to create a model that says, well, what is the best data distribution supply chain that I can build? And but at the same time, it doesn't create anarchy and chaos. So a medallion may be the right way to think about it. For some people say, is it a data fabric? And so it's a combination of those principles, if you will, which we're applying. But then we're trying to stay away from giving it a moniker, if you will. I don't know if if I'm answering you, but I'm just trying to say, I'm trying to stay from any buzzwords to the degree I can.
I appreciate typically no buzzwords are followed with an exact problem, which I'm also trying to avoid. So I appreciate that. So what do you think is a good enterprise approach for combining the multiple types of health information data? Most of it in claims is structured. A lot of it is unstructured, and pop health, et cetera. How do you propose combining that, scrubbing that, get your, let's just say, gold copy in this case, that is in place for data analytics near in real time?
Yes, to me, that's a great question. And I think the one thing I would mention is that you have to be able to assess where are you as an information culture in most organizations, right? Because this is not a one size fits all model in any sense of the word. So what you have to be able to assess is as an organization, what is your information maturity? Are you an organization that's being reactive because you're worried about a legislative mandate, you're worried about a regulatory issue, is what is driving an impetus to what I call data standardization. If you are in that bucket, you're going to be strictly focused on what's going to be required to meet the mandate or meet the regulatory burden. So that's one type of what I call data integration framework you will start with. If you're another organization that's more on the other extreme, which is that we're much more of a prolific data organization, and we want the data supply to be this constant evolving iterative framework, you may come up with a different model. But in some ways, the way I've tried to describe it for our organization is think of me as the builder of your iTunes catalog. I always use analogies that people are very familiar with. I'd say I'm the builder of the iTunes catalog. So the idea being is if I'm Apple, my job is to work with the producers of data, get into contractual agreements, get that data brought into my world of my catalog, and then you pay for a download. So the idea being is that if you can be the owner of that system data catalog, and whatever types of data you have, you are the owner of the data catalog and you work with the producers of data to create that framework, then I think you're doing a pretty good job. And it doesn't matter whether you're a proactive organization or a reactive organization, your job is that the catalog is constantly getting evolved and built. And then I say to my consumers is that you think of you as the owner of an Android device or an Apple device, you want to build your playlist. How do I accommodate that building of playlist for you in the context of data? So it's this catalog building. I see it as more of a central hub function, and organizations have to define what is their iterative 1.0 of a catalog, which then helps you frame how do I bring disparate data into this notion of a catalog. And I think that the common expression these days is do I build a data product architecture? I think that's what I've heard. Like, is it a data product? Is it a custom data product? Is it a standard data product? So think of the catalog or the iTunes store as your data product catalog. And once you have that, then you can say, do I need to build a custom data product and so on? So that's the vision in some ways. I know it's oversimplified, but it helps people to kind of organize themselves to say, am I in the iTunes store, bucket, or am I in the consumer bucket? And it helps you to frame it in that way. So, because in an organization, you're going to have many producers of data, and some of it are the data that you want, but it may be happening in an individual department. How do you incentivize them to add it to a central catalog? So that's kind of, I know it's probably a more detailed response to your high level question, but I just wanted to kind of lay the framework so that people can see what works for each of them.
Yeah, I appreciate the detail, Vijay. A little while back, you touched on patient care.
Yeah.
So, um, if you would walk through maybe some use cases that you've seen that really proactively protect patients at risk,
Yeah.
and how do you do that? From a payer perspective, where a lot of times you only have one lens into the patient.
Correct. And so I think part of this is that as part of the value-based arrangements, one of the things that's been really productive is that as part of any of these value-based contracts, you are trying to influence what can you do about care in general. How do you identify patient risk? How do you look at gaps in care? How are they coming for their annual visits? Are they coming for their mammogram screenings or, those type of things? And there's a way to create a bi-directional data exchange that feeds the data back into their electronic health records of the provider system. So we, for example, are doing work around, patients with high risk around readmission. So there's this readmission score that goes out daily to our provider partners for the attributed population that they have with us, and we feed that directly into their EMRs as an example. We're also working now around gaps in care and trying to identify, are the patients really not coming back? If so, what are the root causes? Is it uh, socioeconomic? So we're looking at social determinants of health and merging that information to say, are there factors that the provider needs to consider? Is it access? Is it language? Is it transportation? How do we look at the barriers for them to get to the care that they need? So that's another thing that we're doing. But I think in general, the construct of a provider payer is becoming payvider is the new term that everybody uses. But it's like, how do you create a bidirectional data exchange that gets to impacting your members from a payer side, but from a provider, the patients that are in their care have a more meaningful healthcare experience. So that's how I see this continuing to build and evolve. But at the end of the day, I think we have to be able to impact both at the member side and working with our providers on the patient side. And that's going to be a continual dialogue if the goal is to reduce cost, improve access, and overall improve health quality.
Awesome. Vijay, I really appreciate your time. This has been enlightening for me. It's been a pleasure meeting you. It's great to hear your thoughts on the industry, especially around data and analytics. And again, I appreciate your time and I appreciate you joining me today. Please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews.
Thank you very much, Ron. Enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you, sir.